At 1:03 a.m., a neighbor's camera caught my uncle hauling boxes from Grandma's porch, while my mother hissed, "Wait until Dorothy's too weak to sign." By sunrise, blue tape numbered her furniture, and a suitcase sat zipped by the door. I run the senior care network they tried to use against her, and I'm about to turn every rule on them. I was buried in end-of-month reports, with the skyline of Austin cut into squares by my office windows when my phone lit up with Grandma Dorothy's name. She never called me during business hours. I answered and heard only her breath, at first thin and unsteady. Then she told me my parents had been at her house, that they said she needed to pack her things, that in the morning she would be moved to San Marcos Senior Living, that a suitcase was already zipped and waiting by the front door. My chair rolled into the credenza as I stood. For a beat, the room went out of focus. Then everything snapped into hard detail. The hum of the air vent, the bitter coffee, my hand gripping the glass desk. I asked if she had signed anything. She said she did not think so, that they had brought folders and glossy pamphlets, and kept repeating it was for her own good, that she was too old to live alone. Her voice frayed on the words. She said she loved her house, that she had lived there more than 40 years, that she still watched the sunrise from the porch and counted the squirrels on the fence. I told her to sit tight, to leave the suitcase where it was, to let no one back in without me. She said she trusted me. I told her I would fix it. I ended the call and opened the Silver Horizon admin portal on my laptop. My fingers were moving before my mind caught up. I sent a priority directive to the San Marcos administrator to cancel any incoming reservation under the name Dorothy Carter, to place a temporary restriction on contact from Patricia and Frank Carter, and to alert site security until legal review. The confirmation ping landed like a lifeline. I was not going to let my grandmother be handled like a problem to be moved out of sight. My assistant knocked once and opened the door. She saw my face and stopped speaking. I told her to clear my calendar and bring my car around. She nodded and disappeared. I tossed my laptop and a charger into my bag, grabbed my jacket, and walked out past the framed awards that suddenly felt like props. In the garage, the air smelled like warm concrete. I slid behind the wheel and pulled out into downtown traffic that moved like a slow river. I crossed the river and headed south past the stacks of highway where red lights blinked on cranes, past the mall glow that makes its own weather, past exits I know by muscle memory. The radio stayed off. I kept seeing the same image in my head, the suitcase by the door of my grandmother's living room. The dented leather handles, the little brass tag I had bought her as a joke years ago. I tried to picture Patricia's hands folding my grandmother's sweaters, tried to understand how anyone could do that without asking the one person whose life would be uprooted. I stopped for gas on Congress and bought a bottle of water that tasted faintly like metal. I unlocked my phone and scrolled to recent calls. Grandma's name at the top. I hovered over it and then stopped. I did not want to stir the fear I had just soothed. The road opened as the evening rush thinned. Headlights ran in twin lines ahead of me, and the city pulled back until it was only a soft glow in the mirrors. I set the cruise and let my shoulders drop a fraction. I went through the facts again to ground myself. San Marcos Senior Living sat a short drive south of Austin. We had completed a full renovation last year. The clinical team was excellent. The security protocols were strict, which would now work in our favor. Legally, my parents had no standing to force a move without a valid medical evaluation and proper consent or a court order. If they were waving around some power of attorney, Maggie would know how to pull it apart. I would call her at first light. I thought about being 8 years old in Grandma's kitchen, the way she taught me to cut cold butter into flour with 2 knives, the way she checked the oven light and said, "Patience is what turns dough into something worth sharing." I thought about the years my parents were chasing flip deals and offshore resorts, and I slept on the pullout in Grandma's den about the time she showed up at my school play, wearing her best church dress, and clapped louder than anyone in the room. I thought about the first time she called me from the porch with a voice full of pride, because I had signed the papers to buy our 5th Silver Horizon property, and how she had said I was building something that mattered. This was the woman they were trying to relocate like furniture. The highway straightened, and the night came down clean and dark. I passed the turnoff for Ben White and kept south toward her neighborhood, the stretch of live oaks that arch over the street like they are holding the sky in place. I could see the scene before I arrived, the cracked terracotta pots, the wind chimes that sing differently with every front that rolls through central Texas, the porch light throwing a circle on the concrete. I pictured my parents standing in that doorway like they owned the air inside, like they had the right to strip her life down to a single suitcase. Not while I was still breathing. I drove through the empty streets after midnight, the highway unspooling in silver lines under the headlights. By the time I turned onto my grandmother's street in South Austin, the air was cool and the live oaks were black against a thinner slice of moon. Her porch light was on. The wind chimes moved in a light breeze and made that thin glassy music that always sounded like a promise. Grandma was waiting in her robe and slippers, hair pinned back the way she liked when she read the paper. She stood when I stepped inside, then sat again as if her knees remembered her age faster than her heart did. I knelt and held her hands. I asked if she felt safe. She nodded, but her eyes were wide and tired. I asked if she had signed anything or given anyone permission to move her. She said she had not. They brought folders and they talked over me, she said quietly, and they told me it was for the best. She took a breath and looked at the suitcase by the door. I told her I was here now and I would make sure no one moved her anywhere she did not choose. I walked through the living room, and everything felt a half step off the way a sentence feels when someone has removed the most important word. On the wall above the sofa, the watercolor of Hill Country bluebonnets was gone. The picture wire was still there, and there was a pale rectangle where the sun had not reached. The small clock my grandfather kept on the mantel was missing too. The dust left a clean oval where it had been. On the dining table, there were stacks of brochures with smiling couples strolling down wide hallways. On the corner of the table sat a manila folder with a photocopy stamped "Durable Power of Attorney," a date from 2 years ago, and a signature that looked like my grandmother's name, but with loops and stems that were not hers. I pressed my lips together and took a photo of every page, then slid the folder into my bag. In the kitchen drawer beside the sink, under her checkbook and a packet of coupons, I found a white envelope with my name on it in her tidy cursive. My stomach tightened before I even opened it. The letter was short. She wrote that she did not remember signing any papers, that something felt wrong, that if I was reading it, she needed help. She had written, "Do not blame your mother. She thinks she is doing what is right. But I am afraid of being taken away from my own life." I held the paper a moment longer than I had to, then folded it carefully and put it with the folder. I checked the bedroom. The jewelry dish on her dresser held a few small studs and a broken chain, but the little gold ring she wore for church was not there. The top dresser drawer was neat, but an empty velvet box lay open like a mouth. In the hallway there were pieces of blue tape on furniture with numbers in black marker. The lamp by the reading chair, the cedar chest at the end of her bed. It looked like the early stages of an estate sale. My jaw ached from being clenched. I took photos of everything. The suitcase by the door, the empty nail where the painting had hung, the numbered tape, the brochures, the questionable power of attorney. I texted Maggie even though it was late. Need to file for emergency relief at first light. Possible abuse of authority. Questionable signature. Items missing and home marked up for removal. She responded with one word. On it. Back in the living room, Grandma sat very straight with her hands folded as if bracing for a test she had not studied for. I sat beside her and asked if she noticed anything missing. She said the painting had been taken down, and she could not find the small ring my grandfather gave her the year I was born. She said Patricia told her it would be safer in a lockbox. I asked which lockbox. She did not know. I told her we would make a list in the morning and file a police report if we needed to. She nodded and then told me something that made my skin go cold. They put stickers on my furniture, she said, numbers and notes. They said it was to make the movers faster. I stood and walked the hallway again, this time reading the small notes on 2 pieces. Donate. Storage. My hand shook for a second, and then went still. I called the night manager at San Marcos from the porch and confirmed the cancellation had gone through. He said the family records were flagged and security was on notice. I thanked him and ended the call. Across the street, a porch light clicked on, and I saw Linda, my grandmother's neighbor, pull her curtain a few inches and then let it fall. I made a note to talk to her at dawn. I helped Grandma into bed, set a glass of water on the nightstand, and left her door half open the way she liked. The house smelled like lavender and laundry soap, and something older that might have been cedar. In the hallway, I stood still and let the quiet sink in. I pulled the envelope out again and read the short lines until I knew them by heart. Then I sat at the kitchen table, spread the brochures and the photocopies out in a neat row, and began building the first list of what had been taken and what I would take back at sunrise. I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and let the screen light spill across the brochures. The house was quiet enough that I could hear the refrigerator cycle on and off. I logged into the Silver Horizon legal portal and pulled up admissions activity for San Marcos Senior Living. There it was in the queue, a pending reservation request under Dorothy Carter submitted late afternoon with a scanned packet attached. The file list showed a durable power of attorney dated 2 years prior, a physician assessment, and a family consent form. I downloaded the packet and zoomed in on the signature blocks. The letters spelled my grandmother's name, but the loops were too large and the cross on the T slanted up where hers always slanted down. The notary seal was from a Travis County office I did not recognize. The physician assessment had been signed off by a family practitioner who did not list hospital admitting privileges and who had checked a box that read cognitive decline without any supporting exam notes. My jaw tightened until it clicked. I forwarded the entire packet to Maggie with a short note that said, "This looks dirty. Verify notary and physician request emergency relief at first light." Her response came back faster than I expected for the hour. Filing at 8, call me at 6:30. I replied with a single thank you and attached high-resolution copies of the questionable signature and the letter Grandma had written. Back in the portal, I opened the security pane and initiated what our operations team calls Guardian Lock. It requires legal counsel approval for any change to a resident's status, blocks all third-party access points, and alerts site security to treat any attempt at admission or discharge as a potential guardianship dispute until cleared. I set a region-wide flag across our Central Texas facilities and pushed the alert to every administrator in a 50-mile radius. The entries populated in a long list, each one a small piece of ground reclaimed. I called the on-call director for San Marcos, and he answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. I identified myself and told him there was a family restriction on the Carter surname, that any appearance by Patricia or Frank should be met at the front desk by security, that no records were to be discussed, and no tours provided until further notice. He confirmed the earlier cancellation and said he would brief the morning team at shift change. With the administrative fires contained, I turned back to the documents. The notary stamp included a commission number. I entered it into the state database, and the record bounced back with an expiration date that did not match the date on the power of attorney. Maggie would love that. I saved the screenshot and added it to a folder I named simply Proof. My phone buzzed on the table. A text from my assistant with backup travel options out of Austin later in the day in case I needed to appear in person for a meeting. I thumbed back a quick update and set the phone face down. The house creaked once like a boat tied to a dock. I walked through each room again with a yellow legal pad and made a list in a steady hand. Blue bonnet watercolor removed. Mantel clock gone. Gold ring missing. Furniture marked with blue tape and numbers. Brochures from 3 facilities, 2 not ours. Photocopy power of attorney dated 24 months ago. Physician assessment with unchecked support detail. I photographed each page of the list and emailed it to myself and to Maggie so that there were timestamps outside the house. At 5, I brewed coffee that tasted a little like the can it came in and stepped onto the porch. The air was still and cool. The street was empty except for a jogger moving under the live oaks with a reflective band on her shoe. Across the way, a curtain shifted. Linda would be awake soon. I would talk to her after sunrise and ask exactly what she saw and when. When the first light touched the tops of the trees, I called the number on the notary seal. A recorded message said the office opened at 8. I left a detailed message requesting verification of the document and stated that the principal had no recollection of signing. I hung up and dialed the physician listed on the assessment. The voicemail greeting said the clinic opened at 9. I left the same message. The calls felt like stakes hammered into the ground around my grandmother's life. Grandma's bedroom door was still half open, her breathing slow and even. I walked quietly to the front door and stared at the suitcase by the frame. I unzipped it and saw sweaters folded with a neatness that did not belong to her hands, a toiletry bag with a new toothbrush still in the plastic, a photo album placed on top as if to justify the rest. I closed it and slid it to the side, out of the path, out of sight. Back at the table, I drafted a short internal memo and sent it to our general counsel and the regional administrators. Potential guardianship exploitation involving a family of a senior resident. Evidence suggests forged or improperly executed instruments. Guardian lock active across Central Texas sites. Awaiting court orders for emergency injunctive relief. Do not engage family without legal present. The sky went pale and the birds started in the trees. My phone buzzed once more. Maggie wrote that she had filed for a temporary restraining order and an emergency hearing was set for late morning. She told me to sit tight to keep records, to keep my grandmother calm, and to keep anyone from crossing the threshold until we had papers in hand. I looked at the suitcase, then at the letter folded next to my laptop, and finally at the coffee cup, leaving a ring on the table that belonged to my grandfather. Then I straightened the papers into one stack, slid them into my bag, and waited for the sun to clear the roof lines. Sun pushed a thin band of light over the rooftops and slid across the kitchen table and the pile of brochures until the paper looked almost translucent. I stood, stretched the stiffness out of my shoulders, and stepped onto the back porch. Dew clung to the grass and the breeze carried that soft green smell that only early morning knows. The rose bed along the fence was still in shadow canes, reaching up in a tangle that needed a careful hand. When I was 12, I learned this bed by heart. Grandma put a small pair of clippers in my palm and showed me how to cut on the angle just above a bud. She said patience is the only way you get more bloom than thorn. My parents were somewhere else that spring chasing a land deal in another state, and I slept on the pullout in the den with a quilt that smelled like cedar and soap. She told me then that family is not who brings you into the world. Family is who stays when it would be easier to leave. I did not understand the weight of it until much later. I understand it now. I walked the fence line and counted the buds the way we used to. A mockingbird hopped along the top slat, curious and unafraid. The wind chimes on the porch gave a thin rattle and then were still. I went back inside and made coffee that tasted better in the morning light than it had in the dark. The living room was quiet and wrong in small ways. The empty nail above the sofa, the oval of clean dust where the mantel clock should have been. Grandma was still sleeping. I opened the hall closet and pulled out the 2 banker boxes labeled House and Insurance in her tidy hand. Inside the house box were manila folders, with decades of receipts for repairs, a photocopy of the original deed, and then a thin packet that made my breath catch. Deed of trust recorded at the county clerk with a loan number and a lender name I recognized from home equity lines. On the signature line where my grandmother's name should have been written in her measured hand, there was instead a flourish that looked like hers from a distance, and nothing like hers in truth. Below it, handwritten Patricia Carter, attorney in fact, for Dorothy Carter. I felt the world narrow to the rectangle of paper in my hand. The notary seal on the bottom corner carried the same commission number that had already rung alarms in my head. The recording date was 24 months ago. The principal amount allowed up to $80,000 drawn on demand. The payment schedule was interest only for a time. In the margin was a sticky note with my mother's handwriting that read, Appraiser Friday, and a phone number. I set the packet on the table, took photos of every page and slid the original into a clear sleeve. On my laptop, I pulled up the county public records portal and searched the instrument number. the screen filled with the familiar grid of entries. The deed of trust had indeed been recorded on the date shown, and there was a follow-up filing 6 months later that looked like an advance. The listed address was my grandmother's house. The contact number on file was not hers. I printed the search result to a PDF and saved it to the folder I had named Proof. I moved to the insurance box and found the homeowner's policy renewal from last year. The mortgagee clause had been updated to the lender name. Another sticky note in the same looping script reminded someone to call about premium escrow. My pulse beat in my ears like a small hammer. I took pictures, saved copies, and wrote a short summary in clear lines on a yellow pad, so that even through adrenaline I would not miss anything when I handed this to Maggie. The clock on the stove told me it was just after 7. Across the street a porch light clicked on, and I saw Linda's silhouette move past her front window. I tucked the boxes back where I found them and carried the sleeve with the deed to the kitchen. I made oatmeal the way Grandma likes, with a little milk and a drizzle of honey, and set the bowl on a tray with a spoon and a folded napkin. Before I picked it up, I went to the bedroom door and listened. Her breathing was steady and soft. I knocked gently with my knuckles and stepped inside. She opened her eyes and smiled the way she does when she is making herself be brave. I told her very simply that breakfast was ready and that I would sit with her while she ate. I did not tell her yet about the deed of trust or the sticky notes or the recorded filings. I wanted the papers from the court in my hand first. I set the tray on her lap, adjusted the pillows, and kissed her forehead. She took a small spoonful and sighed like someone who had been holding her breath for a day. Back at the table, I laid out the photocopies, the letter, and the deed sleeve in a neat stack. The sunlight had reached the far edge of the table and turned the paper warm under my palm. The phone on the counter buzzed a single alert that told me nothing more than time had passed. I drew a line under my notes, wrote down the names of the lender and the notary, and then looked toward the front window. Outside, the street felt like a stage before the curtain rises. I picked up the stack, slipped it into my bag, and listened for the quiet that comes right before the day makes its first demand. Linda opened her front door before I knocked. She was in a cardigan and sneakers, eyes already alert in the morning light. She said she had heard voices outside my grandmother's house in the middle of the night 2 days ago, that she looked through the curtain and saw Frank carry a box to the back of his sedan while Patricia stood on the porch watching the street. She said Patricia told him to just get her out of here and that everything else would be theirs. Linda looked embarrassed as she said it, and then angry, a quiet kind of anger that lasts. I thanked her and wrote down the time she remembered. She nodded toward the doorbell and told me I might have a camera clip. I told her I would pull it and asked if she would sign a statement if needed. She said yes and slipped me her phone number. Back inside, I pulled up the doorbell app and scrubbed back to the date Linda gave me. The feed stuttered, then came into focus with the porch light blowing out the center of the frame. At about 1 a.m, Frank appeared at the edge of the shot with a banker box in his arms. He set it at the foot of the steps and went back for another. Patricia stood in the open doorway with her arms folded. The audio picked up more than I expected. Patricia told him not to waste time, that once Dorothy was checked in, the rest would be handled. The words made my stomach go hard. I saved the clip to my camera roll and backed it up to the proof folder. Grandma was at the table with her oatmeal and tea. I asked if she would be comfortable if I set a small camera on a shelf for a day as a simple record of anyone who might enter. She nodded without hesitation and said she wanted proof of everything. I placed a tiny motion camera between 2 books on the living room shelf and paired it to my phone. I taped a second one under the lip of the porch awning facing the driveway. Wearing consent on my sleeve felt like armor. I called Maggie and gave her a clean rundown. Doorbell video with audio. Neighbor witness with time and statement. Deed of trust in the file box with my mother's signature as attorney, in fact. Notary commission irregular. Physician assessment without supporting notes. Maggie said she was filing a supplemental affidavit with the video and would ask the judge for a freeze on any disposition of assets pending the hearing. She told me to contact the lender to confirm any draws and to document everything with dates and names. I dialed the customer line for the lender listed on the deed. After 2 transfers, I reached a home equity representative who, once I identified myself as the granddaughter and read the last 4 digits from Grandma's policy documents, said there had been a draw on the line for $80,000 9 days earlier. The funds had been wired to an account that was not my grandmother's. The rep said the request arrived with a copy of a power of attorney and a notary page. I asked for the date and the clerk initials on the request. She gave me both, and I wrote them down in block letters. When I hung up, I stared at the number for a long breath. The sticky note in the deed packet had said, "Appraiser Friday." The timing fit like a lock snapping shut. I called the non-emergency police line and asked how to file a property report for missing items belonging to a senior. The dispatcher said an officer could stop by within the hour to take a statement and list items. I said we had photos of the painting that had been removed and the mantel clock that was gone, and a ring that my grandfather had given Grandma. The dispatcher asked for the address and said to have a list ready. The list was already on the table. I added details. Watercolor of bluebonnets framed in oak, last seen above sofa. Mantel clock brass and wood with a small nick on the right side. Gold ring with a single small diamond worn on Sundays. Furniture marked with blue tape and numbers. I included the doorbell clip and wrote the exact timestamp down to the minute. The officer arrived a little before 9. He was respectful and methodical, took our statements, and issued a case number. He said he would note that a guardianship dispute might be underway and that he would flag the report for the Elder Crimes Unit. He placed a copy of the number on the table beside Grandma's tea. She thanked him, and her voice held steady. My phone buzzed again as the officer left. Maggie had filed the supplement. She said the judge had agreed to consider a temporary freeze on any transfer or sale of property connected to Dorothy's name until the hearing. She told me to breathe and to keep my grandmother calm and to keep the house quiet. I walked to the front door and slid the suitcase farther into the corner where it could not be seen from the street. The sun was fully up now, and the wind chimes were talking softly in the breeze. I sat beside Grandma at the table and opened my notebook to a clean page and wrote the hearing time in careful letters. Then I set my pen down and let the room be still. By late morning, the house had settled into a quiet rhythm, the kind that makes every phone vibration sound louder than it is. My cell buzzed on the table and the screen showed Maggie. I answered, and she got straight to it in that steady voice that always sounds like a plan. She said her paralegal had chased down 2 lines of paperwork that mattered. Patricia had used a power of attorney to add herself as an authorized user on a credit account in my grandmother's name. Over $52,000 had been charged in the last 3 months. There was a down payment to a dealership for a new sport utility vehicle and monthly dues to a golf club in Westlake. There were also luxury retail charges that did not square with the way my grandmother lives. I felt my chest go hot, and then very clear. I wrote every number as Maggie read it. Dates, amounts, merchant codes. She said she had filed these findings in a second supplement and had spoken with the court clerk. The judge had reviewed enough to grant a temporary suspension of any authority under the power of attorney pending the emergency hearing. If Patricia or Frank tried to act in my grandmother's name, it would be a violation of a court order. I thanked her and ended the call. I sat still for a moment, palms flat on the table, then moved. I logged into the Silver Horizon admin console and drafted a regional directive in plain language. No site is to accept admissions tours or changes to any record connected to the Carter family without counsel present and written authorization from our legal team. Any appearance by Patricia or Frank will be met at the front desk by security. All staff are to log contact attempts and timestamp them in the incident record. I sent it to every administrator in Central Texas and copied General Counsel. Then I opened the national distribution list and sent a shorter version to every site lead. A minute later, my inbox chimed with red receipts one after another like rain on a metal roof. Grandma came into the kitchen in her cardigan, and I poured her tea. I told her there had been progress, that a judge had put a pause on any papers that let someone else make decisions for her. She nodded and set her cup down with both hands like someone setting down a burden she had been holding for too long. She asked about the suitcase by the door. I told her it could stay right where it was until she decided otherwise. She smiled small and brave. The doorbell camera pinged and showed Linda on the porch with a bakery box. I stepped outside and she pressed it into my hands and said it was just kolaches from the place off Lamar. She asked if there was anything else she could do. I said her willingness to be a witness was everything. She nodded and said she would be home all day if we needed her. Back inside, I called the dealership listed on the credit statement. The receptionist routed me to the finance office. I identified myself and asked to confirm the name on the sales agreement. The manager said the deal had been written in the name of Patricia Carter with supporting identification and a power of attorney for Dorothy Carter listed as a guarantor. He started to explain delivery details, and I cut him off gently and told him a court had issued a temporary order that froze the use of any such authority. He said he would put a hold on the file and ask their legal department to review. I asked for his full name and the time of our call, and wrote both on my pad. I called the credit card company next. The agent asked a series of verification questions that I answered from documents in the drawer. I provided the case number from the police report and told her there was now a court order suspending the power of attorney. She said she could place a fraud alert and freeze the account pending verification. I wrote the ticket number and the time. Then I asked for copies of the applications and authorization forms. She said they would be sent by secure email to the address on file. I told her to add mine for legal correspondence, and she did. A text from Maggie arrived with an attachment. It was the signed temporary order. I stared at the seal and the judge's signature until the lines steadied. The clerk had stamped it under County Court at Law Number 3, Cause Number 24, CCL3 01874. I printed a copy and laid it on the table next to the list of missing items and the deed of trust and the letter in my grandmother's hand. The stack looked like a spine. I drafted one more message to my leadership team. This is a guardianship risk case. Treat it as training material once redacted. We will build a protocol from this when the dust settles. Then I shut the laptop and let the house be quiet again. Grandma called my name from the hallway. I walked to her, and she asked if we could sit on the porch for a moment. We carried our cups outside and listened to the wind chimes. The sun had climbed high enough to warm the top step. For the first time since the call the day before, I felt something give way inside me. Not surrender, just a shift from panic to resolve. I told her we had time now and that we would use it well. She reached over and squeezed my hand, and we sat like that until the tea went lukewarm and the mockingbird on the fence tilted its head as if it understood more than it let on. When we went back inside, I opened my notebook to a clean page and wrote the next set of tasks in steady lines. Call the investigator to coordinate statements. Confirm with the appraiser's office that the appointment was on hold. Notify the local police desk of the temporary order and provide the case number. Speak with the neighbor on the other side in case they had seen late-night visits. Verify with the lender that the fraud alert had been placed, and request copies of the authorization forms. I dated the page and photographed it for the file. The house breathed in and out with us. The wind pressed once on the porch screen and then eased. I slid the court order into a clear sleeve and placed it on top of the stack where I could see the seal. Then I set my pen down and let the quiet hold for a few minutes more, the kind of quiet that comes before you start the next necessary call. Linda called across from her porch a little after 10 and asked if I had a minute. I walked over with my notebook. She held her phone in both hands like something fragile and said she wanted me to see the street camera footage from 2 nights ago. Her son had set up a camera that faced the curb because of package thefts. She tapped a thumbnail, and the frame opened on the street in front of my grandmother's house, the timestamp clear along the bottom. At 1 a.m, her camera caught Frank pulling up and idling at the curb. The porch light on my grandmother's house came on a moment later. The video showed Frank climbing the steps, then returning to the car with a box. Linda scrubbed forward. The audio picked up more than I expected for a street camera. Patricia's voice carried in the quiet, low but sharp. Linda paused and told me what she heard with her own ears. Patricia had said they only needed to wait until Dorothy was weak enough that she could not sign anything. After that, the rest would be easy. The sentence hit me like a hand to the chest. I felt the blood rise to my face and forced my voice to stay level. I asked if she would send me the clip and if she would be willing to write exactly what she heard and sign it. She nodded without hesitation. We stepped inside her entryway where a small table held a ceramic bowl of keys. She forwarded the video to my phone and to my email. Then she sat with a pen and wrote a clean paragraph in her neat print, including the date and time and the exact words she recalled, and signed her name and wrote her number again. I thanked her and told her this would help more than she knew. Back at the kitchen table, I watched the clip 3 times. I saved it to the proof folder and labeled it Linda Street Cam with the timestamp. I scanned her handwritten statement and dropped it into the same folder. I texted Maggie a heads up and then called her. She answered on the second ring. I outlined the new evidence and read her the line Linda had heard. Maggie was quiet for half a beat, then said we needed to accelerate everything. She would file an amended affidavit within the hour and request that the court expand the temporary order to include a freeze on any listing appraisal or moving services connected to the property. She said something else that landed like the click of a lock. If Patricia had secured a line of credit against the house and already drawn funds, the next step would be to move or sell high-value items before anyone could inventory them. We needed to act before a moving truck showed up. I told her the furniture had blue tape with numbers and notes. She said that was exactly what she meant. I called the appraisal number from the sticky note in the deed packet. A woman answered and said she was confirming an appointment made by Patricia Carter for an appraisal at Dorothy's address. I asked for the date and time and the name of the appraiser. She gave me all 3. I wrote them down and told her to note that a court order was in place and that no one had authority to proceed. She hesitated, then said she would place the file on hold and escalate to her supervisor. I moved through the house with my phone and took a slow video of every room narrating the items on camera so there would be a record that predated any attempt to remove them. I opened drawers and closets and showed the empty velvet box where the church ring should be. I ended on the mantel and framed the empty space where the clock had sat the varnish slightly lighter than the wood around it when the light shifted. When I was done, I copied the file to 2 locations and emailed a link to Maggie. She called back 10 minutes later. She had filed the amended affidavit and had spoken to the court coordinator. The judge would review the petition for an expanded order within the hour. She told me to keep the door closed and to let no one in unless it was law enforcement. She also asked if Linda would be willing to give a sworn statement to an investigator. I said yes and promised to arrange it. Grandma came from the hallway and sat at the table with her tea. She looked at my face the way only someone who has known you since you were small can look and asked what had happened. I told her we had found additional proof and that we were tightening the circle. She nodded once and then rested her hand on the table without touching the papers. I could see the outline of her knuckles under the skin, and I had to look away for a second to steady myself. The doorbell pinged and showed no one outside. A passing truck had triggered the motion sensor. I silenced the alert and checked the porch camera feed anyway. Empty. I sent Linda a text with the investigator's number Maggie provided and asked if she was comfortable speaking on the record when he called. She replied that she would be home and ready. My phone buzzed again. Maggie had forwarded a draft of the expanded order for my records. I read the lines twice, the restraint language clear and sharp. Any attempt to list, appraise, remove, or sell property associated with Dorothy's address would be a violation punishable by the court. I printed a copy and set it on the table with the others. The stack was growing, and with it the feeling that we were finally one step ahead. I poured more tea for Grandma and sat across from her in the quiet. Outside, a lawn service started a blower 3 houses down, and the sound rose and fell like a distant tide. I opened my notebook to a fresh page and began a checklist for the next few hours. Call investigator. Confirm with appraiser office manager. Notify local police of the pending order. Speak to the neighbor on the other side in case they had seen anything. When I looked up, Grandma was watching me with a small, tired smile. She said it was good to see me write a plan, that it meant we were almost at the part where the truth is louder than fear. I reached for my pen and underlined the next line twice. I started with the folder labeled proof and paired it to a clean set a reporter could verify, then packaged a short first-person note to frame it. The street camera clip from Linda with a clear timestamp. The doorbell video with Patricia's voice in the night air. The deed of trust with the off-commission notary number. The bank's confirmation that funds had been drawn. The physician assessment that checked a box without notes. I wrote that I grew up in this house when my parents were gone, and that those same parents now wanted to remove the woman who kept me fed and safe. I sent everything to an investigative reporter I trusted at the Statesman and turned my phone face down. She called within 20 minutes. She said the documents were strong and the story reached beyond the four of us. She said she would verify the filings and request comment from all parties and from my company as well. I told her I expected nothing less, then stepped onto the top porch step so Grandma would not hear me pacing. The article posted early that afternoon. The headline used my first name but not my last. The photos were the kind that make a reader stop and feel something. A porch light against a dark street. A suitcase by a doorframe. Rose canes reaching for morning sun. The piece centered what mattered. An elderly woman with no desire to leave her home. A contested power of attorney. A rushed placement that had been frozen. The reporter wrote that Silver Horizon would cooperate with any review and had initiated an internal audit of San Marcos admission protocols. She wrote that a court had issued a temporary order protecting the resident and that a hearing was pending. By 2 o'clock, my company's board chair called and said he had read the piece and wanted me out of public comment to avoid speaking for my own case. I agreed and told him I had already activated a compliance review at San Marcos and expanded guardian lock across the region. He said the right things. Protect the resident. Follow the paper. Let legal lead. He asked if I needed anything. I said I needed my grandmother to sleep without a suitcase by her door. He went quiet for a second and said he understood. Calls from outside came next. A regional ombudsman asked to confirm the transfer had been canceled. A state surveyor emailed to request our admission policy and front desk training records for San Marcos. I forwarded both and asked operations to set aside time for interviews. Then I set my phone on the counter and watched wind in the live oaks throw moving shadows across the kitchen wall. By late afternoon, the bank left a voicemail on the house phone addressed to Dorothy. The caller said compliance had received notice of a court order and that any further draws on the home equity line were suspended. He said they had mailed a notice of default and that an internal review would determine whether the line had been opened or used under false authority. He did not say the word fraud, but it lived in the quiet spaces between his sentences. I saved the voicemail and forwarded it to Maggie. Frank called twice and left messages that swung from aggrieved to pleading. He said we were making a scene, that the money would be repaid when a deal closed, that none of this would be necessary if I stopped trying to be the hero. I did not call him back. Patricia sent 3 texts in a row. She wrote that I was humiliating her, that I had no idea what I was doing, that Grandma would thank her later. I muted the thread and set the phone on the mantel where the clock used to sit. The board statement went live on our site and on the San Marcos page. It said we take guardianship concerns seriously. It said our mission is resident choice and dignity. It said we had paused any involvement with the Carter family pending legal clarity. Inside, the company staff wrote to say they were proud. Outside, a few comments tried to turn it into a corporate scandal. I let the statement stand on its own. There is a kind of silence that is not retreat. It is the ground you hold so you can aim. Grandma napped in her chair, and I used the time to call the other next-door neighbor. She had seen Patricia's car late at night twice in the last week and agreed to relay that to the investigator. I added her note to my file and reorganized the stack until the deed of trust sat on top, then the bank voicemail transcript, then the videos, then Linda's written statement. The order helped me think. First the house, then the money, then the recordings, then the witness. Around 5, the reporter called again. She said the appraiser had confirmed an appointment had been requested and then canceled after a hold notice. She said the dealership had paused delivery of a vehicle linked to a power of attorney, now under court review. She said Patricia had provided a short comment that she was acting in her mother's best interest. She asked if I wanted to respond. I told her the court would do the talking for me. The sky outside turned the color of a ripe peach and then grayed. I walked into the hallway and stopped by the suitcase again. I set my hand on the handle and left it there a breath, then let it go. In the living room, the article glowed on my laptop with the porch light pouring a circle on the concrete. I closed the lid and listened to the house breathe. The silence was not empty. It was the kind that gathers itself before it moves. By morning, the article had crawled through every corner of my parents' world and started pulling threads. An email from a sales manager at a dealership in South Austin arrived first. He wrote that Frank had been placed on unpaid leave pending an internal review after his name appeared in the paper connected to an elder abuse investigation. A second message from a lender followed with sterile language about compliance escalations and account holds. I forwarded everything to Maggie and to the case file without letting myself feel the satisfaction trying to break through my ribs. A courier truck stopped in front of the house and left a thick envelope addressed to Patricia at my grandmother's address. The return label named the Travis County Office of the District Attorney. I snapped a photo of the label and called Maggie before touching anything. She told me to log the delivery and notify the investigator. 10 minutes later, a detective from the Elder Crimes Unit called to confirm that a notice of investigation had been issued to Patricia for suspected financial exploitation. He spoke carefully and did not promise outcomes. He asked if my grandmother felt safe. I said yes, and that we had a temporary order in place. The hearing time on my pad sat like a destination on a map, but there were still miles to cover. I opened my laptop and drafted an email that I wrote and rewrote until every word carried its own weight. The subject line was plain and unmistakable: restoration of rights and restitution. I addressed it to Patricia and Frank and copied the attorney who had filed their earlier papers. I laid out the terms in short, clean paragraphs. Return all items to the home by end of day. Deposit $80,000 into a trust account held in my grandmother's name. Acknowledge in writing that any power of attorney is suspended and was executed without informed consent. Withdraw any application or instruction to move or sell property. Confirm that no contact will be attempted until the court clarifies authority. If they agreed, I would ask the court to consider civil remedies only. If they refused, I would refer the matter to federal authorities for review under financial crime statutes. I added the case number, the police report, the lender information, and the docket number for the hearing. Then I sent it and watched the little paper airplane icon disappear. The phone rang 2 minutes later. Frank. I let it go to voicemail and listened with the volume low. He went from righteous to desperate in less than a minute. He said I was not the law. He said I was ruining a family over paperwork and pride. He said I had no idea what I was unleashing. He said I would regret it when all this fell on me. I called him back because I wanted no uncertainty about my position. I kept my voice even and documented the time. I told him a judge had already suspended their authority, and that any attempt to use it would be a violation. I told him an investigator had opened a file. I told him the lender had flagged the line and the dealership had pulled the deal. I told him his words meant nothing to me without actions that made things right. He said again that I was not the law. I answered slowly so he would hear each word. No, I am the one the law is listening to. He swore and hung up. I wrote the exact phrasing in my notes and sent a summary to Maggie. She replied that the federal referral was not a bluff, and that if a forged instrument had crossed state lines or wires, the jurisdiction would be clear. She reminded me to breathe. I put the phone face down and walked to the sink and ran cold water over my wrists until the heat in my chest retreated. Grandma came into the kitchen and I told her the simplest version of what moved while she slept. Frank had lost his job. The county had opened a case against Patricia. I had given them a way to return what they took and step back. She listened without interruption, then nodded once and placed her hand on the table near mine. Her voice was calm when she said that consequences did not always arrive with anger. Sometimes they arrived like mail. You opened the envelope, and there they were. By early afternoon, Maggie texted me a scanned copy of the expanded temporary order signed and entered. It included specific language that barred any appraisal listing or removal of property. It instructed that all parties were to preserve evidence, including communications. I printed it and set it on top of the stack that was starting to feel like armor. My email refreshed with an automated reply from the attorney copied on my message. Out of office. No alternate contact provided. A minute later, a short note from Patricia appeared. It was a single sentence that said I had twisted everything and that she had only tried to help. There was no promise to return anything, no acknowledgement of the court order. I replied with the order attached again and a reminder of the hearing time. Then I closed my laptop and listened to the house settle. Near dusk, I walked the perimeter of the yard like I used to as a kid, checking the gate latch and the side path and the back fence. The wind chimes found a low, steady song. When I went back inside, I placed the district attorney envelope on the table beside the list of missing items and the banknote and the deed. The stack was a record of the circle tightening. I made tea for my grandmother and one for myself and sat until the steam slowed and the silence in the house turned from watchful to certain. Morning brought a clear sky and the kind of dry heat that finds you even in the shade of a courthouse awning. Maggie met me on the steps with a slim binder and a steadiness that felt like a hand on my back. Grandma wanted to come. She wore her best cardigan and held my arm as we moved through security. The clerk stamped our names on a sign and sheet and pointed us toward a small courtroom with wooden benches and a high seal on the wall. The judge took the bench, and the room came to a full stop. Maggie rose when called and began the story the way the law understands it. She laid out the filings in order and let the papers speak before the emotion did. Bank statements that showed the line of credit draw 9 days earlier, photographs of the empty nail above the sofa, and the lighter strip of varnish where the mantel clock had been. The doorbell video with Patricia's voice telling Frank to make it fast. Linda's street camera clip with a timestamp and a sworn statement. A notarized power of attorney with a commission number that did not match the state record. A physician assessment with a checked box and no notes. The judge asked a few questions of Grandma first. Did she know where she was? Did she know what day it was? Did she know who was with her? Grandma answered in her even voice, and each answer landed like a small stone in a jar. Clear, steady, present. When asked if she wished to leave her home, she lifted her chin and said she did not. The judge watched her for a moment longer than the question required, and then turned back to counsel. Maggie said there was additional context the court should consider on the day the power of attorney was signed. She handed up the pharmacy pickup log, showing a strong pain medication dispensed within the hour before the signature and discharge instructions from a clinic visit that advised no important decisions for 24 hours after sedation. She also submitted a declaration from a geriatric clinician who reviewed the timeline and opined that the combination of sedation and acute pain management could impair informed consent. Maggie did not raise her voice. She let the dates and the paper align. In that quiet, Patricia's attorney stood and tried to pull the weight the other way. He said concern for a senior can be messy, and that families do the best they can under stress. He argued that the signature was valid and that any financial decisions had been made with care. He nodded at my parents without quite turning to face them. Frank sat with his hands twisted together. Patricia kept her eyes trained on the table. The judge asked one more question that felt like the center of the thing. Could the court find that Dorothy retained capacity to make her own choices about where to live and who should help protect her property? Maggie answered yes, and pointed to the evaluation attached to our motion from the geriatric clinician who had visited the home that morning before the hearing, an evaluation that found Grandma oriented, capable, and clear about her preferences. The judge leaned forward and spoke in that measured cadence that makes people breathe differently. The court found that the power of attorney was suspended and that any authority claimed under it was void pending further review. The court revoked any informal guardianship arrangements and declined to appoint a guardian in light of Dorothy's demonstrated capacity. The court ordered that Patricia and Frank return any items removed from the home and deposit $80,000 into a trust account for Dorothy within 14 days. The court issued a no-contact order, except through counsel, and surrendered keys to the home were to be delivered to the clerk before close of business. The order included a directive to preserve all records devices and communications. The judge also referred the matter to the district attorney for investigation into potential criminal conduct related to financial exploitation and forgery. For a second, I did not move. The words had been the goal for 2 hard days, and now they sat on the record like a new foundation. Maggie touched my elbow and nodded toward the clerk. We collected certified copies of the order and stepped into the hallway. The clerk stamped it under County Court at Law No. 3, Cause No. 24, CCL 3, 01874. Patricia brushed past without looking at me. Frank stared at the floor as if it might open. Outside, the air felt different, almost lighter inside the same heat. Grandma took my hand and said she could breathe. Maggie smiled and said she would walk us through the next steps once we were back at the house. First, the lender would be notified of the order. Then the dealership and the appraiser. Then the police report would be supplemented with the court's findings, and the evidence list would be updated with any returned items. She spoke like she was checking off boxes on a form we had practiced together for years. We crossed the street slowly and reached the car. I opened the passenger door for Grandma and helped her in. She smoothed her skirt and looked out at the courthouse steps for a long moment. I sat behind the wheel and rested the certified order on the center console, where I could see the seal catch the light. For the first time since the phone call in my office, a full breath came and went without catching on the way out. I turned the ignition and pointed the car toward South Austin and the porch where the wind chimes would be waiting. Back at the house, the wind chimes were quiet, and the porch was warm to the touch. I settled Grandma with tea and walked to the kitchen table where the certified order sat like a clean line through a mess. My laptop woke, and a new email from the reporter blinked at me. She had received a tip after the article went live. A reader claimed Patricia had been seen at a senior care conference at the Westlake Conference Center a few weeks earlier, speaking with a man known in the industry for aggressive placements. The reader gave a name: Jasper Miles. I did not type anything for a full minute. Jasper was an independent director on our board and the head of a private equity fund that had moved in and out of post-acute care for years. He loved making moves. He loved being the person who knew where the bodies were not buried but stored in plain sight. We had agreed to disagree more times than I could count. I called the reporter and asked for the source details. She connected me with a woman who worked registration at the conference. The woman verified that Patricia had picked up a guest badge as a companion and that Jasper had arrived for a panel in the afternoon and stayed for the networking hours. She remembered Jasper and Patricia speaking in the lobby because Patricia had asked about a facility near San Marcos and the woman had directed them to the map. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I pulled our internal vendor logs for San Marcos and searched for any referral notes. There was a call note 3 weeks old from a third-party consulting group that often fed smaller chains. The contact name matched a firm Jasper used on prior deals. The note said a family might be exploring a placement for a resistant elder and asked about after-hours admission procedures. The author had written that the caller seemed keen on speed and public perception. I opened my personal email and scrolled to a thread from last month about a governance review. Jasper had objected to expanding Guardian Lock beyond pilot markets. He wrote that it would slow admissions. I reread his words and felt the line between debate and sabotage draw itself. The Statesman reporter had also forwarded a screenshot someone had sent to her tip line, a text from a number labeled J to a number labeled P. The content made my jaw set. J had suggested that San Marcos could be a clean solution and that visibility would follow. The screenshot included a time and a date and a location tag near the conference center. The reporter said the tipster would share the original with a subpoena if needed. That was enough for me to start. I called Maggie and gave her the facts without heat. She was very quiet, and then told me to move it out of my hands and into governance immediately. She said the combination of an active guardianship case and a director with potential conflicts required outside counsel. She asked me to write a memo with factual attachments and to let her connect to the board chair directly. I wrote the memo line by line with dates and sources. Conference registration and witness confirmation. Vendor referral note linked to a firm used by Jasper. Text screenshot metadata through the reporter. Jasper's prior pushback on Guardian Lock. I attached copies and sent it to the board chair and to outside counsel with the subject marked urgent. I added a single sentence that I had recused myself from any decisions and that I would be available to answer factual questions only. The chair called and said he had scheduled an emergency governance session for late afternoon. He asked me to dial in and remain on mute until called. I agreed. Then I went to sit with Grandma a while because furious pacing does not make the clock move. At 4, I joined the call from the bedroom with the door closed. Outside counsel spoke first and laid out the concerns. The chair asked Jasper to respond. I listened to his voice through the speaker and felt the old edge of his confidence. He said he had spoken at the conference and did not recall every conversation. He said he had never intended to interfere with resident choice or company policy. He said the screenshot could be anything. The chair did not reply to the last claim. Instead, he asked the general counsel to read the conflict section of our board agreement. It stated that any director engaging in competitive activity that undermines operations or reputation could be removed for cause. It also required directors to avoid involvement in specific cases under company review. The chair asked me to confirm 2 factual points. I stated that San Marcos had received a referral call from a firm associated with Jasper the week before the attempted placement. I stated that Jasper had argued against the expansion of Guardian Lock in writing. I did not add a single adjective. There was a long pause that reminded me of how silence feels at altitude. Then the chair asked Jasper to step off the call for 5 minutes while the board deliberated. The minutes stretched, and then the chair came back with counsel. He said that given the facts and the proximity to an active legal matter, the board requested Jasper's resignation effective immediately. Counsel added that an internal investigation would review any contact between directors and outside placement firms. When Jasper rejoined, he was told the same. He offered a short resignation to be tendered by email within the hour. I forwarded Maggie the outcome and attached the resignation when it arrived. Then I printed it and laid it on top of the stack for a moment before putting it in a separate folder that I labeled Governance on the tab with a black marker. In the kitchen, I poured water and drank it standing up. The house held the late afternoon light like honey. I walked to the porch and stood by the wind chimes and let the quiet come back into the spaces that Jasper's presence had filled, and I felt the path to the end start to clear. The next morning, I walked the yard with a trowel in one hand and a bundle of bare root roses in the other. The soil was soft from last night's sprinkler cycle, dark and loamy the way roses like it. I set each plant where the morning light would find it, dug wide, worked compost into the hole and firmed the earth around the crown the way Grandma taught me when I was a kid. Red varieties along the fence. A pale pink climber for the trellis, one old-fashioned tea rose by the porch steps, because that is where my grandfather used to sit and breathe in the afternoon. Inside the house was quieter than it had been in days. Maggie had called before breakfast. The lender had acknowledged the order and flagged the file for restitution review. The dealership had frozen the purchase and would not release the vehicle. The appraiser had closed the ticket. The county investigator had picked up the case number and scheduled interviews. The no-contact order had been served. The keys were surrendered to the clerk by end of day. The circle did not just tighten now, it held. By noon, a small box arrived from a bonded courier. Inside was the brass and wood mantel clock wrapped in tissue, as if it had never left this house. Beneath it, in a velvet box that clicked softly when I opened it, lay the little gold ring my grandfather had given Grandma the year I was born. I set both on the table and wrote their return into my inventory list, then carried the clock to the mantel and placed it back in the oval clean patch where the dust had not reached. It fit like it had been waiting. I opened the proof folder and set Grandma's handwritten letter on top of the certified order, a quiet anchor that reminded me why we had started. Frank did not call again. Patricia sent a short email through counsel that said she would comply with the order and that she disputed any intent to harm. Maggie replied for us and attached the timeline and the clips. The district attorney's office confirmed that a separate file had been opened to review possible financial exploitation and forgery. I saved those emails without celebration. Some things do not ask for applause. They ask for completion. In the afternoon, I drove Grandma to her bank. A manager sat with us in a small glass room and helped open a dedicated trust account in her name for restitution and for home repairs. We signed the forms with clear minds. No fog, no rush. Back at the house, I called a locksmith to rekey the doors. He showed up before dinner and handed Grandma a new set of keys on a simple brass ring. She held them like a promise and slipped them into the pocket of her cardigan. At Silver Horizon, I asked compliance to compile a redacted training case from what we learned. Guardian lock would be standard across all regions by the end of the quarter. Admissions staff would receive additional screening protocols for family-initiated transfers with contested consent. The San Marcos administrator sent an email to his team that made me proud. Resident choice is not a phrase we print on a poster. It is the first and last question we ask. Evening came on slow and gold. I brewed tea and carried 2 cups to the porch. Grandma followed with a shawl around her shoulders. The wind chimes found a small music, and the new roses sat as if they had always been there. Cars moved down the street, and neighbors walked dogs, and the day folded itself into the kind of quiet that feels like a blessing and not a warning. Grandma took a sip and looked out at the yard. She said that if I had not come when I did, she might have forgotten what family feels like. I felt the words settle in my chest. I told her I had only done what she taught me. Stand up when something important is being taken. Use your hands and your head. Leave a place better than you found it. She smiled without looking at me. The kind of smile that belongs to the air between 2 people who have carried each other more than once. When the light thinned, I stepped down into the yard and checked the soil around each new rose, pressing gently to be sure the roots had good contact. I washed the dirt from my fingers at the hose and sat again beside her. For the first time since that call at my desk, the urgency drained out of my bones. What remained was simple and strong. Love with a spine. Boundaries that held. Justice that did not need to shout. I looked at the mantel through the open door and listened to the small clock sound a single clear note. The house exhaled. The suitcases were empty and back in the closet. The porch light shone its circle on the concrete for no one in particular. I set my cup down and let the warmth sit in my hands. Retaliation had never been the point. Protection had. What mattered stayed where it belonged. If you have ever been betrayed by someone you once trusted, share your story in the comments. Your words might be the light someone else needs to find their way back.